Old new media. For the past couple of years, I have entertained myself, with a little project of study, which I would call old new media. And it started basically from the elementary insight that old media, I think about the printed press, newspapers, but also radio, movies, and what have you, that these old media, at one point in history, of course, were new media, and they entered society in very much the same way as our new media now enter society, all right? And they very often also created very similar effects that were experienced and also voiced and articulated by people as effects of distortion, the rupture of particular forms of order, and a range of issues, that had to be addressed because they were important, they were big, and they were pervasive. So there is this tradition, very old tradition actually, of intellectuals, researchers, but also politicians, opinion makers, reflecting on a number of issues that have to do with new media. And just to give a very early example, many of you will know the classic book which is called Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville, a French intellectual who went to America just after the American Revolution and looked at that new system that was called democracy, and who made a number of very important observations about media in the context of this new system of democracy. He observed, of course, in the United States a unique phenomenon, or at least a very exceptional one for that era: privately owned, free media. All right, and he was ambivalent with respect to these new media. On the one hand, of course, he saw it as a great thing. In very many ways, for instance, the way in which it enabled the ordinary people, the citizens of this democracy, to be informed, to be involved in the circulation of information that was considered relevant and important, for instance, in the context of decision making, while at the same time he warned against the risks of these media. And these risks, were of a variety of different sorts. One was the risk of manipulation by the ownership. So it's privately owned, and that means that private interests can in a way inflect the public debate. All right. But and secondly, also, these mass media and their effect on society might create hypes, might create moments of mass or at least collective irrationality, and in that sense also lead to wrong forms of decision making. So this is a very, very old example, a very early example, right? But you already see two motives, or at least, the duality of perception, which is on the one hand, yes, these media have great potential and have a number of advantages, but at the same time, they raise issues. Okay, and these motives, this particular structure that I just described with respect to a very early example, have a very long life and a very systematic life. They walk all through the 20th century and are articulated by almost every major scholar or thinker about media, about democracy, about the public sphere, and so on and so on. So you find them in the work of people like, so I already mentioned de Tocqueville, but you find them in the work of Lazarsfeld, Paul Lazarsfeld. You find them in the work of Dewey, of Walter Lippmann. You find them, of course, in the work of the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, Adorno, McLuhan, Marshall McLuhan, later also, for instance, Neil Postman, Bourdieu, Raymond Williams, and now, for instance, Yevgeny Morozov. So there is a very, very long tradition of voicing concerns whenever new media enter society, and these new media, of course, through the 20th century include the radio, movies, so the culture industry, after that network TV, and then little by little, of course, also the new online resources that we now have. And when I look through that, tradition, we see always two elements that reoccur, and a shared perspective that also reoccurs. We start with the two elements. The first element is a range of concerns about knowledge. There is an acute awareness in the work of all of those I've mentioned, and many more, of course, as well, that these new media, of course, distort the economy of knowledge, right, and raise issues with respect to knowledge. Notably, two types of issues. One is about quantity. Oh my God, suddenly we get an overload of information, right? Way too much information. And here's a tradition, that already starts when the telegraph was introduced. People would complain about the fact that, now we get way too much information. We just can't follow. No one can read this. No one can process this. So what are we going to do about it? How are we going to store it? How are we going to make this incredible amount of information available and useful for all? Right. So the quantity of knowledge is always an issue. Second, the quality of knowledge. Like, all right, there's so much information, but in that information we already find manipulation, lies, the hypes, that were already anticipated by Alexis de Tocqueville. Moments of mass hysteria. We find, for instance, also political propaganda. Don't forget that in the 20th century we also had people like, the Nazis with Goebbels, the Soviet, the Chinese Maoist system of mass propaganda, which is a media system, all right, in which the entire media environment is mobilized, to provide one particular range of messages and also perspectives. So these two issues always reoccur. So we have a new medium, maybe radio, for instance, okay, and how are we going to handle this new volume of information as produced by the radio, vastly more than before, and non-stop, radio plays the entire day, and then how are we going to maneuver and store all that information that we get around the clock? But secondly, also the quality. What if a very badly intended operator, would start lying all through the radio, knowing that the radio's on all day, and in so many households. In the classical study by Lazarsfeld, of course, the starting observation is that more people in the United States have radios than there are literate people. So in other words, more illiterate Americans are now incorporated in an economy of knowledge due to the radio. And of course, that needs to be addressed. That is an issue. But imagine that somebody starts lying to this huge number of citizens. What will that give? So that's the first range of issues. It's about knowledge, the quantity and the quality of knowledge. Now, related to that second issue is about democracy. All of these authors agree to some extent and to various and in various ways, that we need media, right? That media are essential in a mature democracy. And in that sense, again, if you go to the old work of Alexis de Alexis de Tocqueville, you already find the essence of that argument. A democracy needs informed citizens, all right? It also needs a sort of big public sphere within which that information can freely circulate and be debated, be evaluated, be made useful by citizens, all right, without interference of those who have power and influence. No, it needs to be done autonomously by individual citizens, who in that way will become informed, democratic participants in the processes of decision making. So there's a second set of issues. We have new technologies, we have new media, and they create an incredible potential. But at the same time, they raise issues about democracy. How are we going to use this to the optimum effect in our democracy? How are we going to use this new technology as an instrument for an improved and optimized sort of democracy? The answer is usually education. People need to be educated about media, through media. Media have an educational role and a duty to educate. And then, of course, here it refers back to the issue of knowledge. Media need to be reliable, they need to be true. They should never lie, they should not manipulate people, and so on and so on and so on. Because then media become a danger to democracy. And again, I mean, if you go to the 20th century with Goebbels, that had been amply proven in the 20th century, that media are an incredible instrument for the destruction of democracy as well. But so these two elements, the concern about knowledge in its different new forms, and the question about how to address and optimize that new medium as a vehicle for knowledge. One great concern. Secondly, the role, the function, the potential of these new media for democracy. You find them in almost any significant literature on new media, all through that tradition. So these are the two huge questions. And it means that when we now, in the 21st century, are worried about fake news and about hoaxes and about social media being, the platforms for conspiracy theories and lies and automated machines trolling and what have you, many of these questions have a long life and were addressed before, were raised before, and were also addressed before. So there's a very, very long tradition of exactly these questions. They're not new, and my viewpoint is maybe, if you go back to some of that old literature, you may not only find highly precise and highly useful formulations of the problem that we now also experience, but also proposals for addressing it that we have not yet thought of, or at least that we appear to have forgotten. This is forgotten science, forgotten ideas, and we are sometimes trying to reinvent the wheel while several very good wheels are available. So try to go back to that old tradition. The two concerns. I also mentioned a shared perspective. A shared perspective brings me back to the need for a new sociology of the world in which we live, the online-offline nexus, right? A new sociological imagination. Because if you go through that literature, from the very old examples that I mentioned all the way to a lot of what is now being written about media and about information and within this new media economy, shares a perspective which on the one hand is normative and idealistic. All right, very often the work that people do in looking at these new media is not based on what it is, but on how it should be. And so people are strongly normative, and very often also idealistic, in the sense that they emphasize not the limitations or the risks. They do mention the risks, but very often, they overestimate, all right, how good these media are, all right. Even in everyday, discourse, we still talk about the free press. Now, this is idealistic if you know that the thing we call free press is owned by private entrepreneurs, and in that sense is as controlled as a state-controlled press. And we see examples of that all the time, right? If you think about Fox News, it's free press. It's not owned by the state, right? But it's not free of manipulation, I think. And so here are things we need to address. There's idealism there, and there's normativity. It's very much about how it should be, rather than how it actually works, how it actually operates. In that sense, in a lot of that literature, people really jump to conclusions and to generalizations that, in my view, still demand a little bit of an empirical fact check before they can be formulated in that sense. And then, secondly, and very importantly, if you go through that literature, you would see that the questions that people raise and the way in which they address these new media as an object of study is anachronistic, right? Meaning they address these new media on the basis of old media, all right? And they approach the new society that's inevitably created by the introduction of these new media on the basis of how the old society worked, right? And a main worry is, oh my God, we're losing a world, all right? And that's not a good thing. We are destroying things. Or the stuff we now have, this new media is not really new, or it's just superficial, will never replace, and we're all familiar with that. But anachronism, meaning that we use an old model in order to address a very, very new thing, is endemic to the way in which the tradition of concerns about new media is organized. It's really a central aspect to it. A very good example of that is Lazarsfeld's beautiful study about the radio in the United States. The question that he raises, the research question, is about literacy. So the question is, now that we have radio, all right, will it enable more people to read, or at least do the thing that otherwise would be done by reading? I already mentioned the fact that in the United States, when the radio became widely spread, many illiterate Americans for the first time became included in a media and information economy. But the question was an old one. It was about reading, And so the conclusion, or one of the conclusions of the work that Lazarsfeld did was, no, they listen to the radio a lot, and the radio is good, but it's so superficial if you compare it to reading a good, sophisticated opinion article in the Times, the New York Times, or any other major advanced media outlet. All right. So an old media economy is used as the benchmark for looking at the new one. So here's my conclusion. In a project like old new media, the advantage of it, or the usefulness that I see, is it teaches us, the historicity of issues we now experience as, critical issues for our own society and for who we are. All right, it's good to understand that they have a historicity, that they're not new, and as I said before, that sometimes we find very, very interesting ideas in this old literature. So read that stuff, even if it looks obsolete. You will find sometimes really, really, really good ideas. Okay. But secondly, also, we need to do so from a viewpoint that avoids exactly these anachronisms, for instance, and these idealizations that I find in so much of that older work. The job is not to see how new media relate to old media. No, it is how the new agglomerate of media, old and new, right, recreates and changes society, changes the world, and changes us. I think that is the real challenge, but also the real invitation in terms of research that this project, has. At least it has it for me.